All right, thank you all. I think we're going to get started with this final panel of the day. I appreciate you all sticking around. We're batting cleanup here, so we'll get going. Today, we have heard from experts and our excellent audience about the issues regarding accessibility, security, and the vote. As set forth under the Help America Vote Act, the EAC plays a crucial role in advancing the accessibility provisions established in this landmark civil rights voting legislation. As we've heard in the news, across social media, and a little here today, accessibility and security concerns have become a hot-button issue amongst the elections community, voters with disabilities, and advocates and proponents of election security. Today's conversation has certainly highlighted that the goals of security and accessibility cannot be mutually exclusive, nor should they be. I do want to mention, for those of you who are still here, who I applaud, and those watching at home, a lot of this conversation at times seems contentious or can take a bit of a negative tone, and I think it's worth flagging that the conversation today is focused on some of the real challenges of election administration, and all of the people that work on this do so because they passionately care about the quality of our democracy. And I think, we're down way in the weeds here, and so I think it's important to step back and know that even, when we're talking about making elections secure, we're talking about making them more secure. Our democracy is obviously it's the best thing we've got going. And so I don't want people to lose confidence in the system just because you've got people who are experts in this area talking about how they're working to make things better. And so I think it's important to step back and focus on that a little bit. But I also want to look at how we move forward, and that's certainly what this conversation is about, how we continue to work together and find ways to ensure that tomorrow's elections are more secure and more accessible than those in the past. And a big part of that is identifying real solutions that can make a difference for voters around the country. Earlier, I mentioned that we've heard from a number of experts today. I am not an expert on security or accessibility. I'm an election lawyer, and while most of the time that's followed up with a punchline, which was here too, I'm going to go a different direction with that. And I've learned that when you interview attorneys for a job and you ask them, are you comfortable saying no? Usually the answer you get is, of course, but I often look for ways to say yes. And I think that's part of what this conversation needs more of. And we've heard that throughout the day. And again, I think that's the focus of this panel. But there are areas for compromise. There are areas to get to yes. They just might not be the straight line that someone expects it to be. And so, the way that we get there is working together, is thinking about how we solve these problems collectively. And so in this closing section, we would like to discuss potential next steps and actionable items. We want to do more of that at the EAC, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panel on their takeaways from today's discussions and what we can all do to make progress on these issues. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the folks that we have. And again, this is the end of the day, so it's going to be a little bit looser. People are going to reflect on what we've heard, and we certainly want to hear from you after introductory comments about the questions that you have outstanding, ideas, or other suggestions on thoughts of the direction things need to go. But so without further ado, we have Doug Lewis, who's the former executive director of the Election Center, and as we heard earlier, the birthday boy. Audrey Malagon is a mathematics advisor for verified voting. Alysoun McLaughlin is the deputy elections director for Montgomery County, Maryland, where the EAC sits. Thank you for representing us. And Michelle Bishop is a voting rights specialist with the National Disability Rights Network. So to kick off, we'll start with Doug.
Thank you, folks. I'm going to have to catch an airplane. My wife has Alzheimer's, and she's in year 13 of it, and so I've got her with caregivers while I'm up here, and so I'm going to have to fly home, and so I'll probably leave before this session is over with, so I'm going to be the one that you get to hear from first. Look, elections are entirely complicated things, and particularly when you get to a presidential election year. You cannot believe how much planning has to go into one of these in order to bring all these pieces together to carry off an election that serves voters well and has integrity to it and is counted accurately. And so what we're going to be able to do this year, if it wasn't already in the planning for each of those local elections officials, some 8,000 jurisdictions around the nation, if it wasn't in the planning and part of their overall plan 6 months ago, it's not likely to be implemented this year. So that all of you know that. What we will do with these discussions that we're having this year is be able to implement them in future years on future elections. Now, having said that, when we're talking about some of the worries about cybersecurity, particularly from nation states, there's going to be some implementation of that. But folks, understand, most of these local jurisdictions, even the ones with lots of people in them, do not have the level of technical expertise that it's going to take to actually resolve those issues completely. Now, the beauty and the genius of the American political system is this. Because we're a bottom-up from an election administration kind of process, it would be virtually impossible. I will never say impossible, but it will be virtually impossible for somebody to manipulate a presidential election in enough jurisdictions to actually guarantee the winner that should be somebody else other than the one the voters want. So having said that, you all need to know it's a pretty robust system in this instance and can do well. And it's one of the reasons that we've sort of advised over the years, don't try to create a federal system where you have one election device, one process, one set of rules, because then it does become possible to have more intrusion and have malactions affect elections. And so it's one of those where you sort of have to look at it both ways. It's inefficient. It's designed to be inefficient. Quite frankly, the founders were very distrustful of that centralized process that came from the kings. And so as a result, they created a system that was by its very nature inefficient on purpose. And God knows we've lived up to it in many respects. But it's one of those where that does benefit the process overall, and so you need to know that. When we're talking about accessibility, we have come so far in the last few years, and I want you to know, when we did the survey under the grant from the United States Election Assistance Commission of the voters nationwide, and we did a survey of 3,022, of which 2,000 of those were people with disabilities and 1,022 were general populist types. And so that we could sort of see where the differences were in terms of how voters were treated and how they liked the process or didn't like the process. We had a higher approval rating of the disability folks in terms of election administration at the precinct level. 98% of them said they were well treated and well respected and given what they needed. Now, that didn't mean that some of them did not encounter problems. We know that we still have problems in some of the locations where somebody didn't set up the accessible equipment, where they didn't know what exactly the rules were. So we have some of that. When you're dealing with a roughly 1.6 million poll workers all over the country, you're going to have some variations in the way this gets applied. And so I want you to know we have made it a whole lot better than it used to be and still have got a great deal of work to be done. Part of this is, guys, no matter what you say about what you want in terms of election administration, the kind of thing that we'd like to set up, I've lived with this long enough. I can tell you that politicians will tell you they want this, that, and yonder, but when it comes down to actually putting money to it, to make sure that those local elections folks have all the budget they need to hire the kind of staff they need to hire, to implement the kind of programs they want, to do the kind of audits that you want. The truth is the budgets are just not there. We give a lot of lip service to it, but we don't actually get appropriations to go with it. We are running elections in America with each of the jurisdictions now. We have fewer people employed at the local level running elections than we did 50 years ago. Now, isn't that amazing? Now, part of that's technology, but part of that is also just simply because we won't fund it. And so until we get to the point that we're ready to fund at the level that it actually needs to engage and approve all of the things that we've talked about, we have to know that. If I were a local election official this year, I'd invest in body armor, because both sides have already made clear that they think the other side might steal the election. This is nuts. I don't care what office they hold, from the very top to the very top congressional leaders. You cannot allege as a responsible leader that the process is going to be stolen and expect people to have faith in the fundamental process. If you do not believe in the process itself, if you do not believe that the process is fair, you cannot believe in the government that results from it. So folks, look, we have to be responsible about what we say in some of this and what we do in some of this. And local elections officials this year particularly are going to have everything they do questioned in every level. And so we need to all take a deep breath here and understand the process is more important than the partisan efforts that come with it. And so I encourage all of you to make sure that what we do, we act responsibly, we talk responsibly, we move responsibly to do some of this. The new reality is this. When we looked at 1998, the voters that were, let me look this over here and just make sure I quote this correctly. 1998, those voters that were 45 years and older were about 80 million. By 2012, we jumped up to 80 million. And that's growing at more than 2 million per year now, to where when we get to 2030, we're going to have 74 million folks that are going to be in this deal. When you look at the fact that voters are living longer, the average age when Social Security was passed was 54 for men, and it was 58 for women. Now, men are living to an average age of 85 and women to an average age of 88. And so where we are is that means they're going to be in this process longer. That means more disabilities in a geometric progression. We are not prepared to run elections that have such high disability rates with the way we're running them now. And so we're going to have to look at all of this. I will tell you personally, standing in line in a polling place, if I don't have my cane with me, or if I don't happen to bring a chair that I can sit on, they're not designed for you to rest. They're not designed for you to do anything other than move through a line. We're going to have to change the way we look at this, folks. We are. We also are not equipped because we, as a society, not all disabilities are visible. You know, my wife has Alzheimer's. Unless she opens her mouth and then you engage her in a longer conversation, you're not going to know that. She looks perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, moves around just perfectly fine. And yet, if the situation were that she needed assistance, you would not know that until she tells you that she needs assistance. And so we're going to have to rethink how we do this. We're going to have to understand that not all disabilities are visible. I would say to you, if we want to do something here, and at the risk of upsetting anybody in terms of government, we're not spending enough money on elections to make this all come together the way we ought to. And it seems to me, what we ought to do in my mind is use a rule of thumb, $2 per voter. if we could spend at the federal level $2 per voter every year, we could start to fix a whole lot of these problems. Now, that's not meaning that the EAC ought to get that so that they can hire a bunch more staff. It means that we have the EAC manage a process in which we actually target a lot of these areas and have money to go to those, and so that we encourage this over a period of time. And I'm saying $2 per voter, knowing full well that the U.S. Congress hears that, they're going to cut it to $1 immediately. And then by the time the appropriation comes, it'll probably be half of that again. But we need a continuing deal. The danger of that, of course, is that the federal government then begins to tell you how to run every election in America, and that's always a concern, particularly at the local level. Look, if we're going to do what we need to do, we all have to engage in a sense of goodwill so that we are talking about both security and accessibility, not, as has been said widely here today, one or the other. And we have to accept that this is a priority for America. If it wasn't a priority before, it needs to be now, because we're talking about a tidal wave of folks who are going to need assistance. A tidal wave. I mean, if we get to the point that 30% of our voters or 35% of our voters are people who need assistance, we're not prepared for that. We're not spending enough money to make that happen and to make that accessible in the way it ought to operate. And so these are the things that we need to look at. Look, I don't know that we individually or here as a group that we can change the world. But I know this. We can make efforts to change it for 1 or 2 or 3 voters at a time to where it makes a world of difference to them. And that ought to be what we're after, is how do we make this process better so that everybody feels that their vote counts and that they are fully participating in this. And with that, I'll hush.
Thank you, Doug, and travel safe.
Thank you.
Next up, Audrey Malagon.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am Dr. Audrey Malagon. I'm a mathematician and I'm mathematical advisor to Verified Voting. We're a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization that focuses on election security and the responsible use of technology in elections. We work to apply the National Institute of Standards and Technology framework to elections, and we advocate for best practices that ensure that all voters' votes are secure. I think an important takeaway from today's sessions is that security and accessibility are not mutually exclusive. We have heard very valid concerns about both of these issues, and I really think it's our responsibility to work together to resolve them. At the end of the day, election officials must balance a wide range of voter needs, ensuring that everyone has the ability to cast their ballot privately and independently, and ensuring that those votes, once cast, are securely and correctly counted. No voting method is perfect, and while there will always be some risk, we want to find ways to lower that risk and build resilience in our elections. The introduction of technology, even technology which is vital to the voting process, introduces a different kind of risk than the risks of individually hand-marked paper ballots, so we have to just approach that risk management differently. A flaw or an attack on a system of ballot marking devices could potentially disenfranchise everyone using that ballot marking device system. While it's certainly true that individual errors can occur even on well-designed paper ballots, BMDs are just more vulnerable to more systemic attacks, and so we have to be cognizant of that risk and work to manage that risk when we use them. So with these different kinds of risks in mind, I think as we look forward to best practices and recommendations based on what we know right now and the systems that we have right now, we're looking at voter-marked paper ballots, which is a combination of paper ballots that are marked with pen or pencils, ballot marking devices. At the end of the day, every voter has a right to fill out a ballot privately and independently, and have that ballot retained for audits as part of a resiliency plan for the election. We need to ensure that there are enough ballot marking devices in each polling place to ensure that lines are short, that voters who are using them are not hurried, and further that they're not, the voters using them are not compromising their privacy. Additionally, the placement of ballot marking devices need to make it clear that they're available for use. Voters need to be able to know that they're there and can be used. Poll worker training, we've heard a lot about poll worker training and support. I want to echo that today. These devices need to be set up and they need to be working properly when the polls open. Poll workers need to know how to assist voters appropriately if they're asked without compromising their ballot secrecy. And further, poll workers need to be able to intervene if voters notice issues or errors. I think it's really important that we look at the system design for ballot marking devices. They need to produce paper ballots that allow voters to easily verify their selections using devices or procedures of their choice. Ideally, the ballots produced by ballot marking devices should be identical to any other paper ballots being used in that polling place. Ballots need to be presented to the voters in an obvious way before casting, not just sort of off to the side. And one of the key things I think we really need to think about in ensuring the security in our elections is this verification step. All voters need to be given plain language instructions, signage, poll worker scripts, in addition to any notification that a ballot marking device might provide, instructions to verify their ballot before casting, whether they're marking it by hand or using a ballot marking device. And more importantly, they need to have the time and the opportunity to do so. This should happen at multiple stages, but especially right before casting. I think it's also important that we think about clear written procedures to follow if a voter notices an error between the marked ballot and their intent. And finally, I think we need to incorporate audits. Machine tabulated results should be checked with risk limiting audits of the voter marked paper ballots. The way that we mark our ballots is only one part of the election security process. We need good cyber hygiene, proper chain of custody in ballots, tabulation audits, among other things. So I think these are some of the things we can look to do right now based on the systems we have and the knowledge we have about those systems.
Thank you very much. Alysoun?
I just want to start I just want to start by turning on my mic. I just want to start by giving a shout out to a group of people that do not get enough credit for their hard work on improving the voting systems in this country, and that's all of you here in this room. The advocacy community is essential to not only keeping us honest as election officials, but you are the experts in the barriers that you face. And you're the experts in the solutions that you use to overcome those barriers. And as public administrators, it's incumbent on us, especially when we're looking at a time horizon of the elections that we're administering right now, the elections that can't wait for some future generation of some kind of technology that somebody's maybe working on. But right now, to overcome the barriers that you face, election administrators appreciate, value, and it can always do a better job of making use of your help in finding the workarounds that, quite frankly, we know and you know that we need to adopt in order to take an infrastructure that has barriers, institutional barriers to access, not just in the voting process, but in so many different ways that people struggle to overcome the institutional barriers of the facilities that we use, of the ways that we communicate. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you and give you maybe a little bit of a boost in the arm. I know that it is a challenge. It's frustrating to fight barrier after barrier after barrier, and to keep going on that and keep working with us to accomplish incremental improvements and to educate us is invaluable. And so thank you so very much on that front. On the For election officials, quite frankly, we can be a bit of a defensive bunch, right? Everybody sees themselves as the hero of their own narrative. And so when faced with a criticism or a problem that people haven't anticipated before or feel like they've tried to work very hard to overcome only to hit their own barriers, then, I'll just sort of apologize on behalf of all the overtired, probably underpaid election administrators out there who have been prickly when faced with a problem, because I know it happens. But it is something that we as election officials need to always be cognizant of and need to make sure that we are always not only tapping your creativity, but keeping ourselves with a little bit left in the tank by the time we get to election day, so that we are still able to apply creative solutions and problem-solving solutions for voters who are encountering problems that day getting into their building, or that day trying to navigate the voting process. Looking ahead to the 22 election, the 2022 election, the 2024 election, because right now, let's face it, we're using the technology we've got, right? We're using the facilities we've got, we're using the processes that we've got, and we're building in workarounds and solutions and trying to overcome institutional barriers as they exist in the process today. But looking ahead to the technology, usability is something that we need to think about, not only from the perspective of the voter, which of course is key and primary here. We need to think about usability from the perspective of the poll worker, and we need to think about usability from the perspective of the election official, and we need to think about usability from the perspective of those who are watching our processes and those who are observing our processes, so that when we are conducting post-election audits, we're able to explain those to the public as well. We are, in our office, we take great pains to give our poll workers a lot of hands-on experience. We have small class sizes so that we can make sure that all of our poll workers have that hands-on experience with setting up the ballot marking device. And I say the ballot marking device. We are expanding the number of ballot marking devices in polling places, but it has so often been just one. So we can do certain things, yes, to make sure that the poll workers are able to set it up and use it. But the policy changes that allow us to use technology need to look at usability as an entire, all the various people who need to be able to use these systems. And Maryland's experience with ballot marking devices is a case in point. When Maryland went out for the procurement for our current voting system, there was no intent of only having a single ballot marking device per polling place. The intention was to be using them much more broadly. And then we ran into a usability problem. We ran into a usability problem that had not been fully taken into account in the procurement process and in the usability testing process, which was the use case that we had an alphabetically ordered ballot. And so the candidates who were last in the alphabet were going to be, in some cases, several screens after the candidates whose names were at the beginning of the alphabet, and legal actions ensued. So we ended up not fully rolling out the technology that we were intending to use because of an unanticipated usability issue that we ran into, and a not properly accounted for usability issue in the process. And so when we're looking to the EAC, when we're looking to NIST, when we're looking to all the various stakeholders who are working on the voting systems guidelines, working on trying to make our testing processes better, we can't anticipate every single use case, but Gemma spoke earlier to the efforts that that process tries to do to take these use cases into account, and we just need to keep working at it. We need to keep working to make sure that we are mindful of the fact that there are use cases out there that we haven't thought of yet, and that we need to try to make sure that our equipment is going to meet the needs of the voters once it gets deployed to polling places. For the technology itself, I'm not a technologist and I'm not a lawyer. I'm a public administrator. And we are in one of the larger counties, larger jurisdictions in the country. We don't have the technical expertise to do all of this ourselves. Not all of us have the resources of an LA County to go out and develop our own voting system and take it through the certification process. We are reliant on what's out there, and we're reliant on our people being able to then work with and audit what's out there. And so on the one hand, we need to stop scaring people with false logic about paper ballots being the only secure tool, being, let me rephrase that, about paper ballots being a cure-all for security, because we know paper ballots are not a cure-all for security. I want to amplify what Juan Gilbert was saying earlier about overvote and undervote hacks, which have preceded all of us in the field of election administration. And so election administrators are very cognizant of the weaknesses of paper ballots, and that's why we've looked to technology to help us with these processes. We need to find the ways that we can bring all of these things in together, though, because we are going to have people auditing our elections who do not have expertise in using electronic tools to do it. Election officials are not going to be on the leading edge of technology all the time. We may at times have infusions of cash from the feds, or we can take great leaps forward in accessibility, we can take great leaps forward in technology, but election officials are going to be using the technology that's out there 1 day a year, 2 days a year, in a way that is not likely to be on the leading edge of these issues. And so we need to make sure that those of us who are administering these elections have, at this point, I don't see a way to avoid having a tangible document for audit purposes for us to use, while at the same time making sure that that tangible document corresponds to a way that the voter cast their ballot that worked for them. I don't have the answers to that. I think, one-size-fits-all solutions are desirable, and if we can build one, fantastic. But we also have to recognize that there's a lot of skepticism that we can get to a one-size-fits-all solution, and we have to keep that creativity in mind, that we're gonna have to probably cobble together multiple different ways of voting, multiple different kinds of technology, in order for voters to have the experience that they need, and in order for election administrators to be able to pull that over all together into a single and auditable process. So I will just close by saying that, while I've just spoken a little bit to, words of caution to not expect election administrators to be in a position to be in the leading edge of some of this technological development, at the same time, the security discussions that we're having now do seem to present an opportunity. People are paying attention, right? We're having this meeting, and by virtue of having had this meeting and having people speaking today about the challenges of these issues, I hope we can all take that to inform the dialogue, to inform the development of people's federal legislative proposals, people's state legislative proposals, the targeting of resources to meet the needs. Congratulations to all of you for your hard work in trying to improve these processes. And know that election officials, while we may be a little prickly from time to deal with that, and we need to work on that within our own communities, we're with you, and we're all trying to make these processes as accessible and usable and meet the mandates, not just the promise, but the mandates of the Help America Vote Act to make these systems fully usable and accessible.
Thank you very much. And Michelle?
Last but not least, all right, I got some notes. I'm going to use my notes. I've been taking them all day. Mostly because some of my friends and colleagues who are up here who do elections accessibility advocacy did like 95% of my job for me today, so thank you for that. So I had to make sure I had some notes so I didn't come up here and say ditto. All right, so I've got some stuff in general, some stuff for 2020, and some stuff for beyond 2020. If we're talking about practical next steps. First, I'm going to say we are in the midst of a love affair with paper ballots that has reached a religious fervor. that is unhealthy and will leave our elections at risk. To the point that, I'll say this first, paper ballots are not a goal. Election security is a goal. Paper ballots are one proposed solution, and we seem to have lost sight of that as a country. I have had elections officials look me in my eyes and say to me, I have paper ballots, therefore I have a true and accurate record of the voter's intent. No, you don't. You have a record of how a ballot was marked. You don't know what that voter's intent was. You don't know they marked it accurately. You don't know that they even tried to verify it. You don't know if they verified it correctly. But the fact that we somehow believe that having a piece of paper means I have an infallible record of a voter's intent is really frightening to me. We're going to leave ourselves so completely vulnerable if we actually believe that's true and stop looking for better solutions. Whew. Okay, I already got too fired up. I was just going to read my notes. Something else on a similar point. Alice Miller said this earlier today, and I think it needs to be reemphasized that voters gravitate towards the electronic interface. They like ballot marking devices. Just because a handful of election security advocates tell you they don't like them doesn't mean that they represent all voters or even all non-disabled voters. There are a lot of voters out there that embrace that tech and they want it and they find it easier to use and they find they mark their ballots better because of it. Make sure you're listening to the voices of all of your stakeholders and all your voters, not just whoever tweets the loudest, who I'm sure are literally already dragging me on Twitter right now. Towards that, and also make sure you're including people with disabilities in your process for our elections officials' friends through the entire length of the process. I can tell you what I think works best, but I also don't represent all voters with disabilities. I certainly don't have all their disabilities, and I don't have the experiences that they have. Find voters with disabilities wherever you are and include them in your process. And if you're not sure how to find them, see, this part I'm like almost contractually obligated to do. I work for the National Disability Rights Network. We're a national membership association. You've heard at least 5 of our state affiliates mentioned today. We are federally mandated. We exist in every state, territory, and district in the United States, and we're funded through HAVA to work on access to the vote. So if you don't know where to find people with disabilities where you are, go on ndrn.org. You find them or the affiliate of our network in your state or territory. You call them up. They're going to help you do this. Okay, let's talk 2020. I think this point was made, but I'll make it one more time. We have to stop segregating out voters with disabilities. It's a violation of their civil rights. That should be reason enough to end the segregation. We had a little known Supreme Court case that talked about separate not being equal, and so I thought we had learned that lesson in this country. But when we talk about election security, we all get real comfortable with segregation again. So that's something we're not going to do anymore. Every voter should be voting the same method when they go to their polling place, or at the very least, every voter should be offered every method and allowed to self-select what they think is going to work best for them. Train your poll workers. Please train your poll workers. It's true. I know it came out of Alabama today. Some poll workers aren't being trained. That's terrifying to me. Please train your poll workers. I understand it's not a federal requirement, but it's still the undeniable best practice. Okay, let's talk beyond 2020, because that's all I got. Arguing about ballot marking devices is getting old for me. I can't do it anymore. So those are my 2020 recommendations. Thinking beyond 2020, we need to expand the voluntary voting system guidelines. The fact that they're limited to the components of one voting system is not enough if we're still allowing one accessible voting device per precinct in the United States. That in itself is a form of segregation. We have to expand the scope of the VVSG to address that. Congress has a lot to say about election security these days. I really don't need them to do that. I need them to put money into elections. I need their money where their mouth is. We should be giving money to states and local jurisdictions to fund elections properly. Loved that. Doug is gone. Loved that $2 per voter. And since he's not here and I didn't get to say it to his face, I will say while we're live streaming, happy birthday to my dear friend Doug Lewis. Right? Research and development, research and development, research and development. The reason we keep having the same terrible debates about ballot marking devices is because that's what we have right now. And if we put money into research and development, maybe we'd have other technologies to talk about. In terms of the tech industry, elections are not a big money industry, right? They're not making smartphones that everyone in the country buys. They have a very limited clientele. Literally only elections officials buy their product. It's not a big money industry. We need Congress to put money into research and development. I hope the EAC will revive their research and development funding as well as a former grantee. And then I just have one last point. This was something Diane Gold had mentioned early in the day that I wanted to bring up again. We need better press coverage. We just need better press coverage. Press loves talking about election security. Okay, you're going to keep doing that, I understand. But first and foremost, I need you to start explaining what you're talking about. Because you can't keep throwing around the term Russian hacking without telling anyone what that means. And you can't keep saying 2016 was hacked without telling them what you actually mean was some people tried to get into voter registration databases and they were detected and deterred because there's no evidence a single vote was flipped. And we need to start explaining that to voters because we're terrifying them, but not by talking inside baseball to a bunch of people who don't speak this language every day. And I'd like to see a little more coverage of elections accessibility as well. We could have a little more balance there. Now, that's the nice version of that, because the last thing I'm going to say that Diane mentioned, she didn't take it all the way home, so I'm going to do it, because most of you in this room know me, and you know I'm kind of a spicy person. So I'm going to say it. Shame on you, Today Show. Shame on you. If you're going to cover what's going on in LA County and not talk to a single person with a disability about the fact that voting accessibility is federal law. That is not journalism. You could have done us the courtesy of an interview. I understand you spoke to Dean Logan. Dean Logan's a great guy, but he's not a disability rights advocate. I didn't get a phone call from you. And I will expect better from you, NBC. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That's a hard act to follow, so I won't do it. I will pass it to you all. Want to make sure that, again, a lot of today has been about hearing from you, and so we want to make sure to be able to get any questions that you have for this panel or takeaways that you've had from today. So I'm going to let Doug Chapin take it away. If we don't have anybody immediately, there we go. We have a winner. We have two winners. It's like an auction.
Hi, I'm Bernie Hirsch, Chief Information Officer for Microvote. We make voting systems. So, first of all, I think last is best. All the panels have been great, but you three, including the gentleman who had to leave, wow. This is just, wasn't this great, this panel here? I have so many things I want to ask each one of you, but for the last 13 years, I think there's only been maybe 1 or 2 years that I haven't been involved with testing and certification of a voting system and designing and all of that. And so the usability issue, so important. And that's what we've really seen, right, is issues with our usability, much more so than perhaps accessibility or security. That's where we've seen some of our systems fall down. So I think really putting a laser focus on usability is so important. But I do have a question for you, Audrey, as a PhD of mathematics. So our system is completely accessible. It's not a ballot marking device, it's a DRE that's a push button device. So it's really great for people with visual disabilities. And then this year we've introduced thousands of voter verifiable paper audit trail printers in the booths that where we are. And so now we can do risk limiting audits, but I've been investigating new technology, and we've actually done some hardware modifications to our system that's right now in certification with the AC to allow it from a hardware standpoint to transfer the amount of data that would be required to conduct an end-to-end encrypted election in partnership with Microsoft. So several other of our manufacturers have been doing that kind of a partnership, and that is an alternative to a paper-based system. It's one of the only, as far as I know, they're going to be accepting an end-to-end encrypted system as an alternative to a paper-based system, which is a secure electronic-only system. So from a mathematical standpoint, what do you think about the encryption involved in end-to-end, the math of that, and also as it
is really cool.
as it applies to quantum computing? At some point, we're sort of playing cat and mouse with the speed of our computers being able to eventually brute force their way through our encryption. So what is the state of the art of that, and where are we going with that? And is that, in your opinion, a viable, marketable option that the public would accept? Because if you don't know this, I don't know, do you know how the first voting machine was patented by Thomas Edison? but he didn't go into the business. He decided not to because it wasn't going to be commercially viable, right? That was his first patent. He went on to do the light bulb and some other things, and I'm happy that he did, but we're still trying to make these things commercially viable. So there's an end-to-end encrypted. Should I pursue that as something?
So first you asked me what I thought about the math and end-to-end encryption. So I'll say the math is really cool. That's what I think about the math in there. But I mean, and I think, Michelle, you made a good point about, what are we looking for in a voting system and a voting solution? The reason that voting poses some hard problems is because we need verifiability. We need to be able to, in essence, have a recovery plan and auditability that we can be, what we know reflects the voter intent. But we also want to preserve a secret ballot. And those two things are difficult to do simultaneously. And so paper ballots are one way that we have attempted to resolve that problem. I think end-to-end encryption could be another way. I think there's some promising things happening there. I haven't seen details of a system, to be able to sort of comment specifically on any particular process, but any system that allows us to have something that we can verify, that a voter would, know that their vote was recorded in a way that reflected their intent without compromising, without being able to trace that back to the voter, I think is promising. So I think those are the things we're after in voting solutions, is verifiability together with protecting ballot secrecy. And I hope we find good ways to get there.
Thank you. And while we move the mic, I'll just say for those of you who didn't think we were far enough in the weeds, end-to-end cryptographic systems are the place to get to. So thank you, Bernie.
Hi, thank you for today. My name is Scott Sonnenberg, and I'm a brand new election official in Prince William County, Virginia. And I've appreciated all today. It's been a drinking from a fire hose effect for me. And I just learned about the Cleary Awards. And my question is there any best practices from the Cleary Awards that we didn't cover today that might be useful for me to take home? Thank you.
I'll take that, absolutely. The Clearys, for those of you, or just to cover them, the Clearinghouse Awards are something that the EAC does. We awarded Nickel earlier here in person, but it's really a great opportunity. We have the stories of these on our website, eac.gov, but it's really a great way to highlight an array of the best practices that people are doing around the country. It's primarily election officials that receive the awards, but not exclusively, as we saw. And so really encourage you to visit that and see those stories, because, again, it's really one of the great things in election administration to see this innovation, see the benefits that we get from creative election officials really doing a great service for their voters, and then their colleagues around the country being able to rip those ideas off and tweak them for their own purposes, which is the whole point of the Clearys, to recognize innovation and award it. And I'm also sitting next to someone from a 2-time Cleary Award-winning jurisdiction, so certainly want to defer.
Can I jump in and just sort of say, I'll try to be quick, but to both of the last two questions, which they go in the same category in my head. So end-to-end encryption, I'm sure, is a really fabulous thing. But if you want me to run it, then I need to learn how to understand it and explain it and use it and do it. And so keep that in mind. Pilot practices are great. Best practices are great. The Cleary Awards are great. Yeah, we got 2 of them on our wall. But I don't learn, I learn a lot of cool things from chasing after the bright, shiny objects of the best and the coolest and the most innovative things that somebody else has done and trying to steal it. But I learn more when I find out how my neighboring jurisdiction is doing it, or how sort of like the middle of the road jurisdictions are doing something, because those are a lot more achievable and those are a lot more replicable.
I just wanted to add quickly, first of all, welcome. We're so happy to have you. I think we talked about things today like the need to train poll workers, but if you go on the EAC's website, there's practical stuff you can use like training curricula and programs for recruiting and retaining poll workers that I think will be really helpful. There's some really amazing stuff on there. You should absolutely go to eac.gov and check it out.
Hi, my name is Kelly Israel. I work at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So before my question, I just want to say, Michelle, I'm 30 years old. I still want to be you when I grow up. The thing that I actually want to talk about is we're talking about a lot of emerging technologies that will have the ability to hopefully bring more voters with physical disabilities to the table. But whenever anyone mentioned the word usability, I immediately thought of how totally inaccessible every ballot I've ever filled out is from a cognitive standpoint. Like, okay, I understand who I'm voting for president on most of these ballots, but have you seen the 3-paragraph long essay about some random provision in Maryland that may or may not destroy my human rights? Because those happen a lot, and there is no chance on any planet, anywhere, that a person with an intellectual disability will be able to make sense of them. There's also an issue of security in terms of, so under federal law right now, people with intellectual disabilities have the right to have a supporter with them in order to help them fill out a ballot. I wondered about the security concerns that play in there and how to balance usability and security when it comes to getting people with cognitive disabilities the ability to fill out ballots. I don't know if this question even makes sense at this point, but I tried.
I can start by saying that I also want to be me when I grow up. So we have that in common any day now. One of the easiest answers that I always give, I'm so happy Whitney Quisenberry is here in the audience, Center for Civic Design, Field Guides to Ensuring Voter Intent, are all about elections as a design problem and designing ballots and materials that we give to voters well for clarity to address some of that. And I think that's part of it. Some of that stuff, like the ballot initiatives that are written in legalese, are a much harder fix. There's a much more of an uphill battle there. I will say in the immediate sense, because I know you come from an advocacy organization, you have the ability to reach out to voters, make sure they know about the resources that exist outside of the elections office that they can use. I work in elections for a living. I can tell you right now, when I fill out my ballot, I vote absentee because I have to work all election day, right? From before polls open until they close outside my home jurisdiction. So when I'm filling out my ballot, I kid you not, I pull up vote411.org. from the League of Women Voters. They show me my ballot. They show me the language that'll be on my ballot, a plain language description of that. If you vote yes, you're saying this. If you vote no, you're saying this. This is what proponents say. This is what opponents say. So I can understand what on earth I'm voting on. If anyone else votes in Fairfax County and cannot understand all those weird tax initiatives that are on our ballot every time. So I think until we can fix a bit of a legal problem there with how those things get on the ballot and how they're written, we need to make sure voters know about those other resources.
Yeah, and just in general, do you write ballot instructions in plain language?
Yeah, the remark for the captioner was that maybe also write ballot instructions in plain language.
That's where I think the Center for Civic Design materials are really helpful.
I do want to note that we want to be respectful of time and people's schedules, so we really appreciate everyone being here today. I want to thank this panel in particular. I have sincere gratitude and appreciation to these panelists and their dedication and for being here. Thank you.
And I promise I'm not trying to dodge any more questions. I'm trying to catch a train before it starts snowing in Virginia.
Who knew? Breaking news. Thank you, Audrey. I'd also like to I'd like to recognize the EAC staff again. I know it was mentioned earlier, but really an amazing job putting this event together today. Couldn't be done without them, and really that spans an amazing spectrum of activity to pull this event off. I saw our acting executive director carrying around a child that I know is not hers, so Really appreciate all the hard work that went into making this day happen. This conversation will clearly continue, but as it unfolds, we must remember that HAVA's requirements and other protective laws, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, demand that Americans are given the equal opportunities to vote. But making voting accessible should not be dependent on meeting legal minimums. It should be about striving to ensure that all eligible Americans can vote privately and independently. And frankly, the story of the American franchise is a history moving toward inclusion and access. We know that it's not always been perfect. There have certainly been ebbs and flows but we have to keep trying to move forward and striving to make it better. In election administration, we must continue to focus on practical solutions when considering the challenge of ensuring a secure and accessible election experience for all. I know the can-do spirit of election officials will meet this charge. My fellow commissioners and I stand ready to lead in this area, but success depends on all of us working together. I thank you for being here and participating. And lastly, if you can, please be a poll worker. Thank you.